Welcome back. Last time we looked at the beginning of the Jerusalem ministry of Jesus as narrated in Matthew's Gospel. In particular, we examined the entry of Jesus into the city of Jerusalem. Then looked at two parables, the two sons and the tenants, to see how previous Matthean themes were developed in those parables. In our current session, we continue the ministry of Jesus in Jerusalem with yet another parable, the wedding feast, which has that unusual add-on concerning the wedding garment. We then will turn to the question of the Pharisees on paying taxes and conclude our session with the question of the great commandment. As we reach the Jerusalem ministry, we realize that the end of Jesus' total ministry on earth is rapidly coming to a conclusion. Matthew, following the lead of Mark and Luke, narrates the whole ministry of Jesus and his passion, death, and resurrection as taking place within a single week. We're now at the beginning of that week. Correspondingly, a number of parables concern householders who are going on a journey. These must be interpreted with Jesus being the householder and the journey being the journey to the Father, which will be accomplished through his passion, death, and resurrection and ascension. Therefore, these final parables tell us how to conduct ourselves in the absence of Jesus. The parable that begins chapter 22 of Matthew's Gospel is known as the parable of the Great Supper, to link it with its Lucan counterpart, Luke 14:15-24. And also it's known as the parable of the wedding feast, since its context in Matthew is a wedding feast. The parable is joined to the preceding through the simple phrase, "And answering, Jesus again spoke to them in parables." This generally is seen to be a standard formula of introduction, as there has been no question posed to Jesus in the immediate past context. Further, it tells us that what is coming is a parable, presumably meant to explain yet another aspect of the kingdom of heaven. Since the recipients are described by the pronoun them, it's presumed that they are the same audience as the preceding session, that is, the chief priests and the Pharisees. The parable then begins, confirming our suspicion. The kingdom of heaven is like a man, a king, who made a wedding feast for his son. It should be familiar by now that the wedding banquet or the wedding feast is a symbol of the final age, the last days. And so, the king sends his servants with the mission of calling those who are invited to the wedding. We have to give a little background here. This is not our usual practice regarding weddings. In the ancient world, when there was to be a wedding, the invitations were sent out to the prospective guests, who in turn would return their acceptance of the invitation or their regrets. That part is similar to our etiquette with regards to wedding invitations. The difference comes in the action narrated here. Once the wedding preparations have been made, and it is time, a second invitation is issued to those who said they would be present. That is what the servants are doing here. You could say it's a sort of a reminder. What's interesting is that the invited guests have now changed their minds. They're not willing to come. The imperfect tense of the verb to be willing, thelo, implies that this isn't a sudden refusal. It's a persistent unwillingness. Hagner and others will liken this to the persistent unresponsiveness of Israel to God's repeated invitation through the prophets. When the servants return home with the news of the guests' unwillingness to come, the king dispatches a second group of servants with a specific message. Behold, my meal is ready. That's the only use of the word ariston in Matthew's gospel for meal. It implies the festal meal for the wedding, whose preparations are now complete. What this means is then explained. The bulls and the fattened cattle have been sacrificed. So everything is ready. The guests are to come to the wedding. Given the situation described here, for a significant number of the guests to continue in their refusal would be very costly to the king who's hosting the wedding, and would come across as an action shaming the host or the king. The invited guests are not concerned, paying no attention to that at all. Rather, they departed, they went away, one to his field, which was presumably in need of his attention, another to his business, which also seemingly was in need of attention. Hagner and others note that they act as though there never had been an invitation, going about their normal activities. But that's not the worst of it. Those who don't go off to their normal activities react negatively. They seize the servants, insult them, and finally kill them. This seems to be an outright rebellion against the king who had invited them. We see similarities to the tenant farmers in the preceding parable that we had in the last session. As would be expected, such shameful insolence from would-be guests infuriates the king. The shame inflicted on him by the refusal and the ill treatment and murder of his servants must be avenged if he's to save face. Thus, he now sends troops to destroy those murderers and burn their city. Many see this as a foreshadowing of the destruction and burning of Jerusalem in AD 70. Having retaliated for the shame inflicted upon him, the king still has a problem. He recaps his current situation for us through a statement to his servants. He has a wedding celebration prepared, and those invited have not been found worthy. The servants are therefore to go to the crossings of the roads. Diexodos is the Greek. The word literally means cross street, but more than likely it refers to the point where the city or the town streets turn into country roads at the town limits. These were the places where many people would be passing. So they're to travel beyond the town to the countryside, and whomever they find, they're to invite to the wedding feast. Note that where the vineyard was taken from the Jewish leaders and given to a nation that would produce the fruits of it, here the servants invite as many as, hosos an in Greek, they can find. Their invitation, in other words, is open to all. So, the servants fulfill the wishes of the master. They go out into the roads, gathering all whom they might encounter, evil and good. The result was that the wedding hall was filled with guests, that is, those who were reclining. Now note, reclining is the standard position for those taking a meal. Arnold notes that this is a curious reversal. Instead of the privileged few, now the undeserving and unworthy many are invited to the wedding. This is where the Lucan parable ends. But Matthew continues his version of the parable to an unusual conclusion. The king now enters the banquet hall to see and greet his guests. As he's making his way among the guests, he sees a man not dressed in a wedding garment, an enduma, a garment, gamu, of the wedding. Note, the Greek verb duo means to dress. So, enduma would be that with which one is dressed, that is, clothing or a garment. And as such, enduma gamu, gamos being a wedding, would be a garment for or of a wedding. So, he stops and addresses the man. Friend, how is it that you entered here not having a wedding garment? Now, the fact that this man was just called in from the streets, was not dressed in a wedding garment, and is called out for it seems a bit peculiar. The immediacy of the invitation did not leave much time for the local to get to the local tuck shop and get the formal wear. Note also the address, friend, hetaira, which refers to comrades or companions who were mostly followers of a chief. So the king now sees these guests as his comrades in virtue of their acceptance of his invitation. Further, some posit that just as many fancy restaurants today have suit coats available for customers who may have need of one, so also the wedding garments were available, and this gentleman chose not to wear it. In any event, his response, or rather non-response, to the king is telling. He was silent. Literally, he muzzled himself. He kept himself from speaking. Arnold notes that this reaction, coupled with the address of the king, implies that whatever the case, this guest did have proper clothing available, but chose not to wear it. I see a variant of the Matthean theme of saying and doing in this. It's not just enough to accept the invitation to come to the wedding feast and show up. In several places in the New Testament, a change of clothing implies a change of one's way of life. Since the kingdom here is likened to a wedding feast, it's not enough to come to the wedding feast, that is, accept the invitation to the kingdom. One must change their way of life to conform to the kingdom. That is, put on the garment required by the wedding feast. As a result, signified by the particle tote, then, the king commands his servants to bind the recalcitrant guest hand and foot and throw him into the outer darkness. This terminology, outer darkness, appears in several places in the gospel to refer to eternal judgment. See in particular Matthew 8:12 and Matthew 25:30. This is linked to yet another favorite phrase of Matthew for judgment, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. For this, see Matthew 13:42, Matthew 13:50, and Matthew 24:51. The entire parable ends with an appended logion drawn from the Jesus tradition. It appears in various places in the Synoptic Gospels. For many are called, but few are chosen. This saying is a great summary of the parable. The contrast of many versus few sums it up well. The many refer to the second calling when the servants were sent out to invite and bring in as many as they can find. The few implies that not all those who were called will make it. To be given the invitation, and even accepting the invitation, as we have said, is not enough. Those originally called, invited, or chosen did not fulfill their acceptance of the invitation. This more than likely refers to the original chosen people who did not readily accept the proclamation of the kingdom. So, again, there is a hint that one must do something as a result of the invitation. That is, put on the wedding garment, change their way of life, and live in accord with the righteousness of the kingdom. Having inserted the three parables on the place of Israel into the Markan material, Matthew now rejoins the text of Mark on the Jerusalem ministry with the narrative of the taxes or tribute to Caesar. The protagonists in this text are the Pharisees, who are attempting to trap Jesus in a situation for which there seems in their minds no way out. Yet, as we have seen in several places in the gospel text, Jesus is not going to allow himself to be caught by such a trap. Again, linking this text to the preceding through the particle tauta, then, Matthew presents the Pharisees. Since their last appearance in the gospel at the end of the parable of the tenants, they have reacted to what they have heard Jesus saying. So they regroup, take counsel, and determine that they're going to entrap him in his own words. Recall that the language take counsel has appeared in regard to the Pharisees earlier in the gospel text. At 12:14, they, the Pharisees, took counsel against Jesus concerning not entrapment but destruction, how they might destroy him. The verb to entrap, paigiduo, comes from the noun pagis, which literally is a trap. So they're planning how they will set a trap and get something that they can use against him. They set their plan in motion, sending their disciples with members of the pro-Herod party, also known as the Herodians. They approach Jesus and begin by buttering him up. They address him with the very respectful title, teacher, rabbi in Hebrew, or didaskala in Greek. Matthew has used this title consistently when someone who's not of the band of the disciples addresses Jesus. They continue attempting to sweet-talk Jesus. We know that you are true. Again, the Greek is telling. The adjective aletheis means true in the sense of honest to goodness, real or genuine. They're saying that Jesus is the real thing. But do they really believe that? They continue. And you teach the way of God in truth. Aletheia again. That is honestly or genuinely. This noun aletheia is from the adjective aletheis used in the preceding phrase. Further, it is not a care to you concerning anyone, for you do not see into the face of humans. Jesus is totally impartial. He does not have preference for anyone. He teaches what God wants. As a result of this, then, now the point. Tell us, therefore, what it seems to you. What do you think? Or better yet, where do you stand on this thorny question? Is it permitted to give tax to Caesar or not? The tax referred to was the kenson, or the head tax, the tributum capitis, based on the population numbers from the census. Note the similarity of the words kenson and census. So after all that sweet talking of Jesus, they zap him with a question that will, they think, bode ill for him, no matter which way he answers. If he says it is permitted or lawful, then he will be seen as giving in to the oppressors, the Romans, and supporting them, which will not ingratiate him to the oppressed Jews. If he says it's not permitted or not lawful, then he will be seen as a revolutionary by the Romans, fomenting sedition. Jesus, however, will not be taken in by their antics. He realized the ill intent of their question and calls them on it. So he responds, "Why do you test me, you hypocrites?" Recall that the Greek word for hypocrite is hypokrites, which is the normal word for an actor, one who is not what they seem. So Jesus realizes that their sweet talk is just that. They're out to get him. And so he's going to beat them at their own game. Show me the coin of the tax. That is, the coin used for the head tax. They immediately present him with a denarius. So, having been presented with the denarius, he questions them, of whom is the image and the inscription? This is a Roman coin. It has an image on it. Jewish coins contained no images, in accordance with the command that there be no graven images. So what is a good Jew doing with a coin which has an image on it? Much more so, as they answer, the image is Caesar's. Here is a typical Roman denarius. On the left is the image of Tiberius Caesar with the inscription, Tiberius Caesar Filius Divi Augusti. That is, Tiberius Caesar, son of divine Augustus. On the right is the reverse side of the coin, the Roman goddess Pax, with the inscription Maximum Pontii, translated by some as high priest. So Jesus then responds to their original entrapping question. Give the things to Caesar that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. So the coin bearing Caesar's inscription and image is Caesar's. So give it to him. Pay the taxes. But more importantly, follow your obligations to God. So that what the obligations to Caesar, the state, when the obligations to Caesar, the state, inhibit your obligations to God, God wins out. We saw earlier in the Gospel of Matthew that Jesus was willing to pay the temple tax, a tax demanded by the Jewish authorities. Now he shows that same willingness to pay the Roman kenson, or census tax. Further, in light of where this unit appears in Matthew, Matthew may have wished to show that just as the tenants had not given to the master of the vineyard what was his, so now the Jewish leaders may not be giving to God what is rightfully God's, even though they say they are. That being the case, Jesus has now turned the trap on them. The would-be trappers are now entrapped. The concluding line shows that the smooth-talking questioners were impressed with the way that Jesus worked his way out of the trap. Having heard him, they marveled. They cannot help but admire his answer. As Hagner notes, Jesus has shown himself to be the one who teaches the way of God in truth, genuinely, not like the Pharisees. As a result, they leave him and go away, presumably frustrated, as the leaders do in Mark 12:12. Another group now takes the place of the Pharisees and Herodians to pose their own conundrum and trip up Jesus, the Sadducees, who question him on the reality of resurrection, which they do not believe in. Again, Jesus shows his keen ability to slice through an argument. They're followed by one of the lawyers of the Pharisees, who tries in his own way to trap Jesus with the popular question of whether or not the law can be summarized. The Pharisees may have gone off, but they're not very far away. They quickly hear of the silencing, literally the muzzling, of the Sadducees. They're pleased that Jesus is in agreement with them in regard to the notion of resurrection. Pharisees held to the notion of resurrection, while the Sadducees, accepting only the first 5 books of the Old Testament, rejected the notion. But the Pharisees, despite their pleasure, are, I am sure, distressed over the fact that Jesus has come out on top with yet another group of the Jewish leadership. So, they gather together in the very same place, choose a representative to present their query to Jesus. Contra to Mark, that representative is a scribe, a lawyer, not a scribe. And he is presented as testing Jesus, rather than being impressed with Jesus' answers as the scribe was in Mark. The lawyer addresses Jesus with the title teacher, rabbi in Hebrew, didaskala in Greek. Then he poses his question: which commandment is the greatest, or is the great in the law? The adjective megale, which is the positive of great, appears without an article. Hence, it can refer to the greatest. Thus, the lawyer asks which commandment is the greatest or the most significant in the law. This was a hot question among the Pharisees of Jesus' day. Was it possible to summarize the law in 1 or 2 great commandments? Among the Pharisees, there was a rather large volume of commandments that had accrued into the law, 613 to be exact. 248 positive, corresponding to the number of bones in the body, according to some rabbis, and 365 negative, corresponding to the number of days in the year, according to others. In fact, there is a story about 2 of the great rabbis of Jesus' time, Shammai and Hillel. A proselyte came to Rabbi Shammai and asked if he could state the whole of the law while standing on 1 foot. Shammai sent the proselyte off. The same proselyte came to Rabbi Hillel and asked the same question. Rabbi Hillel picked up 1 foot and said, "What is hateful to you, to your fellow don't do." That is the entirety of the Torah. Everything else is commentary. Go and study. Jesus is not fazed by the rabbinic debate. He responds citing Deuteronomy 6:5, which is part of the Shema, which is recited by the good Jew twice daily. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. In other words, love God with everything that you have, your whole being. Now note, Matthew makes a few alterations in the text of Deuteronomy 6:5. He adds mind while dropping strength. Then Jesus announces that this is the greatest, and first commandment. Now, if there's a first commandment, then there must also be a second. And indeed there is. Jesus continues. The second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. This is a citation of Leviticus 19:18. As shown in Genesis, our neighbor, our fellow human being, as well as ourselves, have been made in the image and likeness of God. See Genesis 2. Thus, if one truly loves God, then it's a natural conclusion that they will love God's image. Our love of our fellow human being is a genuine sign of our love of God. And lack of love for our fellow human being puts in jeopardy our statement that we love God. So very truly, these two are a summary of the law. Now, there has been some question as to whether or not this is the first time that these two texts have been joined together. Philo of Alexandria does allude to a junction of these texts in his writings. But, utilizing a rabbinical technique, the joining of these two texts can be considered to be a gezerah shawah, or an analogy. The principle of gezerah shawah states that if two texts share a common word or words, in this case you shall love, the one can be used to interpret the other, and so the two are linked. Now, this is the third time that a variant of Leviticus 19:18 is cited in Matthew's Gospel. See also Matthew 5:43 and Matthew 19:19. Jesus then summarizes his argument. On these two commandments stand or hang the whole law and the prophets. Note the term law and the prophets is the way the New Testament refers to the Old Testament. All Scripture thus depends on these two crucial texts. Paul will express the same thought in his letter to the Romans when he says that love is the fulfillment of the law in Romans 13:10. Now, Hagner, citing Gerhardsen, sums up the discussion of the summary of the law as follows, and I quote, "The twofold commandment, as set forth in this passage, may appropriately be thought of as nothing less than a hermeneutic program for the understanding and application of the law and the prophets. Thus, love is the fulfillment and heart of the commandments." Well, that's about all we have time for in this session. Next time, we'll look at the fifth and final discourse of Matthew's Gospel, the eschatological discourse. See you then.